Welcome back to a new episode of Transformed and Renewed. If this is your first time checking us out, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button on your screen. That way you can stay up to date with the latest content that we have. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe button on your screen. And again, if you are returning as a guest member, welcome back. Have a good topic for you. Last time we talked about processed foods and we got into the basics of what processed foods are. As I mentioned last time, we're going to get into some research. And I know that when it comes down to sharing research, I like to make it very simple because some people may cringe at the idea of looking at a research article. But trust me, it is not as bad as you think it. So we're going to walk through it again. If this is your first time looking at a research article, and a lot of this information is actually open access. That basically means that you could essentially go to the websites and you can access this information without necessarily having or needing a membership or even an account. This information, again, is open access, open to the public. So it's up to you to access it if you like to learn more about it. And I think that it is good that you have your hands onto this information so you can see that, again, it's not myself that's making up these results that we get from processed foods, but you can actually see it for yourself. So, got a couple of studies, I will say, and because they are quite lengthy, which is a good thing, but I know that I would not be able to get through all of the intricate details of the research. And so we'll try to go through some highlights so that way you can at least see the key parts of this research. And then you also see, like, hey, are there some changes that I need to make as it relates to processed food? So just a brief recap. Last time we talked about processed foods. So you have different classes. You have unprocessed or minimally processed foods. These can essentially be in the same category, but you could split them because unprocessed foods could, as I used the example last time, an apple. Minimally processed would more so be taking the apple, cutting the apple, and then you likely may freeze that apple, and that would be a minimally processed apple just because it has underwent less than 5 steps in the process. Then we transition to lightly processed. And this is where you may add some ingredients such as salt, sugar, maybe an oil or a fat. You may also add some other ingredients, could be oats, could be invert or inert sugar, and that may just be all that you add to that product. Could be dried, could be cooked, whatever you want to do with it. That would be an example of minimally processed because it's now having more ingredients added to it, as well as maybe an additional step or two. Then you have ultra processed, and this is basically where you just have a lot of ingredients added. Some ingredients you may recognize, some ingredients you may not. A prime example of an ingredient that you may not recognize is an ingredient known as sodium benzoate or sodium acid pyrophosphate. Okay, so these are just some examples of different chemicals, and then these can also go through heating steps that could essentially degrade or destroy the nutrients that would be present in the original food itself. So, again, thinking about an apple, taking it through a hot heat process or even cooking it for a higher temperature could essentially destroy the nutrients, even within the fiber, can destroy those nutrients. Okay. And so we'll see through some of these research how that can be problematic, especially if you consume a lot of ultra processed foods. But let's get into it. How does ultra processed foods affect the body? So give me 1 minute as I share my screen. And again, this is going to be one of a few articles, depending on how I can navigate through this. Like I mentioned, these are some extensive articles that cover a lot of information. So hopefully we can navigate through each one of these. But bear with me as we dive into some of this research. And there we go. All right. So this is one of the articles. It talks about ultra processed foods. It's an analysis of three large U.S. prospective cohorts. And cohorts is basically taking a group of participants before any research work has started. So you're basically evaluating the individuals before any type of analysis is conducted, before you start to provide them with whatever tests or type of measurements you want that will help with the research. So this is just basically showing that it's a large group of individuals. And as we navigate through the study, we'll see what the number is. I want to say that for at least one of the numbers, it was over 50,000 participants that participated in one of the three large cohorts. So this was split. So off the back, typically with some research articles, may start off with a background, sometimes typically an abstract. This one may be set up differently. Sometimes you may have an abstract that would basically be a summary, which this is a summary, but this is more so split into sections. But here you have the background, or in other words, it's like a kind of like a brief introduction. And then we got the methods, findings, interpretation, funding, how the research was actually sponsored or funded. But going back up to the background, you can see that have different acronyms. So in this case, this study was actually looking at groups who were used to evaluate their consumption of ultra processed foods, as well as looking at the correlation between CVD or cardiovascular disease. Okay. And so here, in addition to that, looking at other aspects such as coronary heart disease and then stroke. So cardiovascular disease, CHD, and then stroke. And down here, wanting to scroll to the introduction, which pretty much gives us a layout. It basically is just listing the facts. And so, what are the facts? So, again, as I mentioned, ultra processed foods, ingredients that, to extend the definition, contain or extend the palatability. And so this is relating to the pleasure or the acceptedness when it's in the mouth of a food product. So if you taste something, you're like, that's very good. That is relating to the palatability of the food. Then you have the profitability of the food. So is it cost efficient for a person? So let's say a person has $5, or let's say they may have $50. Is this food product, like if they were to buy it, is it worth them buying multiple units of it? So let's say with that $50, that particular food product may cost, I don't know, $2. So with $50, they could buy 25 units of that. And to them, if the food product tastes good, is very flavorful, and they really enjoy it, that is also another factor, as well as the shelf life. How long does the food last once you buy it, prior to opening it, as well as after opening it? That also has a value when it comes to different people, because some people may say, hey, if it has a shorter shelf life, if I know I'm not going to consume it, but yet it's expensive, I may not want to buy it. So this is just getting into that briefly. So, kind of as we go along, we kind of see that with the ultra processed foods, they may promote, cardiovascular disease through several mechanisms. Now, this is going to be extensive because you see a lot of commas coming up, and so this is going to be the vital part for you to pay attention to. So, when you think about ultra processed foods, they typically contain a lot of excess sugars, calories, sodium, Some unhealthy fats. So when we think about fats, there are different types of fats. So you have saturated and then you have unsaturated fats. And so thinking about the types of fats that you consume, it's also important because a lot of companies use various fats, but typically fats that are not don't have a good profile, especially when it's consumed in the body and how the body metabolize metabolizes that fat. And for many people, consuming a lot of unhealthy fats can lead to, which we'll look at, the buildup of a lot of a lot of fats in the artery. And we'll cover a term shortly that talks about that. But going on, it says it talks about below the nutritional quality UPFs. UPF are sources of compounds generated through production and packaging related to microbiota alterations. This basically has to do with the gut microbiome, inflammation, higher diabetes risk, and then this word proatherogenic apolipoproteins. And so this is going to be related to proteins that bind to fats that essentially clog the arteries. And this is not good because then you start to this can also lead to the incidence of stroke as well as the elevation of CVD, which we talked about. So again, it talks about different compounds like bisphenol A, emulsifiers, thickeners, sweeteners, acrylamide, monosodium glutamate, which is popular in a lot of wait for it, fast food products. Okay, so you think about fries from a lot of fast food restaurants, monosodium glutamate. You think about any type of food where it seems like it's very addicting in terms of taste, likely, and this is just a strong guess, but there's a high probability that it contains either monosodium glutamate or maltodextrin. And if you don't believe me, just do the research because I've done enough of it, as well as I've seen the ingredients with some of the food products, even on the shelves that tend to be ultra processed, they likely contain, especially chips. Cannot debate me because, again, go in the store, you can look at the nutrition label. I can guarantee you for most of the chip products that are very popular, they likely contain monosodium glutamate or maltodextrin. Okay. So let's scroll on. So we're looking at the cohorts. Like I said, I'm just kind of zooming through this because it's quite extensive. I think we're still in the method section, excuse me. And so we haven't even gotten down yet to the results of the discussions, which is pretty long. So we can see that the cohorts, this is basically this paragraph here that we see about 120K, 120 22K, excuse me, female nurses between the ages of 30, 55. That was one study. Another study was about 116K women between 25 and 42. And this was during in 89. And then 51, 52K men 40 through 75. And this was in 86. So this was basically following a study of these individuals, but it's still good information because, again, a lot of research sometimes it may conduct a short study, and so you may not get a comprehensive look in terms of the years that it took to really follow different individuals. But I think that this is good because it actually followed these individuals for quite some time from prior to the actual study being started and then after it being started. So as we scroll down, I also see some information related to the different areas or the different groups related towards ultra processed foods or the foods that were evaluated. So you have breads and cereals, ready to eat, heat mixed dishes, you have hard liquor, and then artificially sweetened beverages. Okay. So scrolling down, Let's see. Scrolling down, we want to get to the results. Like I said, this is quite extensive and it's interesting work. Let me just go here because I may have passed it. Okay. Yeah. So this is a table of pretty much the different areas that were evaluated. So obviously the basic demographics, race, ethnicity, and then you have the different groups of ultra processed foods or UPFs that were evaluated. And in this top section here, pretty much shows the mean or the total ultra processed food quadrant that was evaluated. And this was based on, yes, so 84 and then 91. And then this has it broken up. Let me see. Yeah. So has this broken up based on the quintiles of energy proportion and then in total calorie intake and then energy proportion from UFP in total calorie intake. And then obviously C is just not age adjusted. But anyway, this pretty much gives us a better idea in terms of the numbers as relates to this study. And just kind of going scrolling through this because there's several tables. And I usually just like to get to the meat of this information. Like I said, it's a lot of information to pile through, and I want to make sure that we can navigate through it. But here, as it's kind of highlighted, this shows the correlation between UFP, again, that means ultra processed foods intake, and CVD, cardiovascular disease, in the three US cohorts. Okay. Now, this didn't include liquors, yogurt, sweet, sugar sweetened beverages, as well as processed meats. So everything else, which it included, was breads, ready to eat meals, as I mentioned earlier. So let's get down to a section. Let's see. And a lot of this is critical information. I just like to get down to the root, the meat of it, so I can show you that way. Had we have more time, I would dive more into it, but this is just a lot of information, and I like to make sure we can get to the meat of it, which is here, the discussion. Okay. But for those of you who really like to get into it, it's definitely a lot of information. I could have broken down, but I also realized that it took me a while to break down some of the information earlier. But at least here, we can see that from at least the research shows that there is a correlation between UFP or UPF, excuse me, intake as well as CVD, which means that the more you consume UPF, means that your risk of CVD increases. And as we talked about with CVD, that includes coronary heart disease, the risk of stroke, microbiota or microbiome changes in your gut. So this is where you have a lot of bacteria in your gut. Typically, you want to have good bacteria, but when you have a lot of ultra processed foods, those likely do not contain a lot of nutrients that your body needs. So what happens? Well, the bacteria in your gut changes negatively. So sometimes you may wonder, why am I feeling, crazy, or why am I feeling weird? And a lot of times it can just be related to what is going on in the gut. And I know that from different research, it talks about how the gut is also known as the second brain. And that is because, at least from some earlier research studies, they made a connection between the gut microbiome and the brain having a linking, okay, when it comes to just the activity that occurs. But let's go down through this discussion some more. It says, so yeah, it says conversely, ultra processed savory snacks, cold cereals, yogurt, Dairy based desserts were inversely associated with cardiovascular disease and CHD, coronary heart disease risk. So, UPF bread and cold cereals were associated with a lower stroke risk. Okay. And hard liquors with lower CHD risk. Okay. So, not everything is necessarily bad. Okay. And I know sometimes people may think there is a typically a biasness if you say, like, well, if this is bad, then everything else is bad. At least here is showing that these were associated with a lower risk, but it doesn't say no risk. It just means that there is a lower risk compared to some of the other groups like sugar sweetened beverages, processed meats, artificially sweetened beverages. That's a topic that we'll talk about at some point because I know a lot of people like to drink a lot of beverages that may not contain sugar. So it may say zero sugar, low sugar. And there were actually some studies, I believe, recently that came out discussing how a lot of artificially sweetened beverages may not be as good as sugar for filled beverages. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other because they both are not, in essence, promoting nutrient absorption by the body. They have no nutrients, okay? When you have a lot of sugar, that basically defeats the purpose of a lot of nutrients. We have a lot of artificial flavors that can also just defeat the purpose as well. Okay. So we'll talk about that more in depth. Artificially sweetened beverages. I want to say, at least with this study, it may have been in another study where they mentioned that there was more research that had to be done just because while the study was extensive, they still wanted to have more conclusive, or I guess more repetitions of that research. Okay. So instead of just conducting that research one time, they wanted to kind of monitor certain aspects, making sure that whatever food groups were evaluated, or even when you refer to ultra processed foods, that the definitions are the same across the research studies, which I do understand. And I don't have a problem with that. Different researchers wanting to make sure that the information is consistent and that you have a base standard for that. But here, let's look at another one because again, this a lot of research articles contain a lot of information, but let's see here. Yeah, so here it shows that conversely, high fiber content, minerals, phenolic compounds, and other whole grain ingredients in some ultra processed foods may explain their inverse association with cardiovascular outcomes. So again, with some foods, because they do contain some nutrients, not to say that they just have zero nutrients, but because they do contain some of these nutrients, the effect of cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease is a lot lower compared to some other groups. And that is, again, what this is saying because of some of these minerals, vitamins, nutrients that are still present. Okay. So, at least with this study, this also talks about different limitations. Like I said, there are some things that they realized with this study that they would likely improve upon. So while I share this information is not meant to be like the end all be all, but it does shed light still on what was found in the research that there is a a relationship between ultra processed foods and coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease in different groups, especially foods that contain a lot of added ingredients, especially high fats, high sugar content, sodium content, etc. So there was another article that I had. Like I say, this one talks about the association of, if I can share that briefly, the association of processed foods with Give me 1 second. Yeah, with severe non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or another way you can look at it is NAFLD. Okay, and that is just an acronym for. Uh, again, this one is, I want to say, quite extensive as well, and just looking briefly, just trying to see what groups they actually had evaluated. But essentially, this is also looking at the relationship of consuming a lot of ultra processed foods consumptions and the severity of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And fatty liver disease is quite important. It is one that should not be overlooked, because one thing about the liver is it does a lot. The liver can clean, it can it can just do a lot of different things in the body. When it comes to cleaning itself, uh, not typically in the foods that you can consume that would essentially clean the liver, because it will essentially clean itself. Now, not that's not to say that no food can help improve like liver health. There are obviously a lot of foods, especially the more nutritious the food is, the better. But when you're not consuming a lot of foods that is helping the liver to do its job, then it can lead to a lot of I guess unwanted changes in your body. Okay. So again, if you have some time, and again, I know that I'm a little short and want to go too long with this, but at least you can see that this is some good research. At least to me, I can read some research in minutes, especially when I'm just really just engaged. I can it probably take me a while when I start off, but once I get into an article, it takes me a few minutes just to get through the article, at least kind of looking at the high level information as well as the key information. So my apologies if you see me scrolling, because I'm just scrolling through this. And this is one that I looked at briefly earlier, wanted to look at more, but I think I spent more time on this other article evaluating it. But this is a lot of good information. So, in case you wanted to look at this later, if you have any questions about going through some of these articles, this is one you can basically take a screenshot. But once you type this in, this is on the website Science Direct. Okay. While you can sign in, you can have an institutional account or an organizational account. You don't necessarily need a subscription to view this. Once I click on this, this is actually open access, which means that in another screen that pops up, it just makes a PDF version of this article. And that's just for you in case you say, hey, I want to download this on the go. I want to look at it. Then you can do just that. Okay. So with this other article, let me share that with you so that way you can have this information too. Let's see. Let's see. That one was, yeah, this one as well. So this is, let's go up. This was ultra processed foods. Again, you can take a screenshot of that, save it. Some good research to read. Again, for me, I like to read this, but at least we can see that when it comes to a lot of ultra processed foods, they you might want to be more mindful about them. I'm not going to say that all foods are created equal, because they're not. And also I don't want to sound biased. That's why I like to share the research to show what does the research say about it. Because a lot of times the research goes through multiple individuals. It does the cohort studies, which it takes groups of people to evaluate them, at least the ones that do like large numbers over 10,000, and it tracks them for a period of time, whether it's a couple of years or over a decade or two. Those tend to have some more solid, concrete results. But at least we see from the first study or the first research article that we looked at was that ultra processed foods can increase the risk, cause there to be a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, which is not good because that tends to affect the arteries of the body. So where the blood pumps to the heart, from the heart to the lungs, to give you the oxygen that you need, and just even to do like day to day activities, that can become an issue. And we don't want that to be an issue, especially if ultra processed foods have a vital role to play in that. So we want to make sure that we are monitoring the types of foods that we're consuming. And next time we'll actually go more in depth about how do we really avoid the ultra processed foods craze, because for many people, as the first research article that we looked at, taste, pleasure of the food is a big factor. The cost, efficiency of the food is a big factor as well as the shelf life. So if a person knows, like, hey, I can buy this, I can store it however long as I want to, and I can eat it whenever I want to without it spoiling too quickly, then for me that's going to be high value compared to something like fruit, which could typically spoil within a few days because it's fresh, it's whole, it's not preserved by anything. So you typically have to consume that, otherwise it will spoil. So we'll get into that topic next time. But if you enjoyed this, like I said, it's a lot of information to cover. And if you want me to cover more in depth, then you may have to set up a session with myself, because I definitely don't mind going more in depth about different research articles, especially as it relates to your health goals. And that way I can also answer any questions that you have, as well as if you say, you know what, Jared, let's go deeper into some of these research articles. Let me tell me, like, what do you really make of this article? Like, I think I understand about, I'm just not really. Tell me that in advance, and I can definitely provide that in a live video, answer some questions, go through some definitions, which are very important when going through different research articles, to make sure that common terms that are used are understood as we refer to them. So these are all good suggestions or feedback that you can share. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. With that, if you haven't yet, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button on your screen to stay up to date with the latest content that we have. We're working on some content, and I may have some news for you. Got some news on the press today. I am still working on it, but I may have an announcement about something that could be a event that we are likely going to attend with the masses. And so again, I'll share more results on that. But again, this is hot on the press. So that way, if you say, you know what, I want to know more about that, you got to make sure you subscribe, because otherwise, if I share it, you're not subscribed, and I don't know what to do. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. Okay. And hopefully within a week, I think it is, because again, I'm working on it. It could be this weekend where I do a post about what we're doing, especially if you're local in the area. You could be seeing us very soon in the community. So that's all I can say right now. But until next time, hope that you enjoy your day, and I'll talk to you later.